These men are all patients in a hospital located on the Isle of Wight. The hospital is inside Parkhurst, one of our top security prisons. 1/3 of these men are known to be suffering from schizophrenia, a devastating form of mental illness, whose symptoms include hearing disembodied voices, seeing vivid and terrifying hallucinations, and believing you are being persecuted.
From Golf 2, there's no wagon outside, over.
The real difficulty is we're witnessing cuts in health service care for the mentally disordered, and inevitably some of those people, or a lot of them, will finish up in prisons. Prisons are becoming a dumping ground, in other words, for the mentally disordered.
Nobody knows exactly how many people suffering from schizophrenia and other forms of mental illness are being held in prison. The official Home Office figure is just 300 out of a total prison population of 45,000. The Prison Officers Association reckon that the number of severely disturbed prisoners runs into the thousands. But even this estimate is massively below the level indicated by the surveys completed by a number of different academic research teams.
The main surveys which I've been able to identify showed a variation of between 30 and 45% of people in prison with psychiatric disturbances of one sort or another. And if you look at recidivists with long sentences, then that proportion rises higher.
Dr. Weller's conclusion indicates that there are between 14,000 and 21,000 people in prison who should be in hospital and who should have been sent there when they first came in contact with the police or the courts. Rudy Pollard is from Twickenham near London. He suffered his first schizophrenic breakdown at 18, just after splitting up with his girlfriend. Until then, Rudy had been a happy and normal teenager.
He couldn't describe the feelings that, he was going through. All he was doing was sitting in a chair, huddled up, and just telling us how frightened, how petrified he was. It was visual on his face, his fear. And then about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, he came into my bedroom, woke me up and said, "I just want to see you with your eyes open."
For the past 5 years, Rudy's been in and out of hospital, sometimes being discharged when he's still badly disturbed. On one occasion, he left hospital and went round to his sister's flat.
He smashed the car the first time, smashed all the headlights on the car. My daughter wasn't in, but the car was there. The second day he went back, and because he'd smashed the car the previous day, my daughter wouldn't let him in. So he then kicked all her windows in. Because she lives semi-basement, he was able to put his foot through and kick all the windows in, which frightened her. She's got a little boy and she was really frightened. So she phoned the police for help, and they came round to her, and by this time he was running and screaming up the street. She explained to them that her brother was ill, and they didn't want to arrest Rudy unless she pressed charges.
In theory, Rudy should have been taken back to Shenley Hospital for treatment. Instead, he was held overnight, charged with criminal damage, and told by the magistrates to appear in court the following Friday.
When he didn't appear on the Friday, they issued a warrant for his arrest, which they must have got to his flat early in the morning and picked him up. And they took him to court on the Friday. His father went with him that afternoon, and I expected that Rudy sometime that Friday would be in Shenley Hospital. When my daughter phoned me from the court, I was horrified that they'd actually called for a further 3-week remand for medical reports, even though the magistrate had a full report from the consultant psychiatrist at Shenley in front of them. they called for a further 3-week medical report.
Rudy was taken from the court to the hospital wing of London's main remand centre, Brixton Prison.
I just couldn't believe it. I thought, this has no possible benefit to my son whatsoever, being sent to Brixton. But they said it was a hospital wing, so I took their word for it. So, you know, like an idiot, that day I'm phoning up the hospital, as I thought, to see if my son had settled in okay, to be confronted with prison wardens that spoke to me like I was a nothing, and this is a prison, and, you know, we can't give you that sort of information. He was locked up in a cell for 23 hours a day without anyone with him. I don't think that for 3 weeks, when somebody is in the mental state that Rudy was in, could have done him much good. For the next week and a half, I was phoning around everywhere, solicitors, trying to get Rudy out of Brixton as quickly as possible. I even went to see Rudy's MP in Brent, and he more or less put his hands up in the air, you know, and said, well, you know, if it's in the hands of a solicitor, if he gets into difficulties, you know, contact me. But really, you know, there wasn't any really constructive advice on how I could get my son transferred any quicker.
Glasgow, where Vincent and Betty Canute live with their 3 children. One of their sons is a paranoid schizophrenic who refuses to take any medication and believes his parents are plotting against him.
It's getting through this barrier to keep him on the medication. This is where you need the backup, I would say, with the social workers or something like that. People to guide him. See, Vincent can't even fill in a form. He can't at the moment. He can't concentrate on anything. If he rejects us, who is there? There's nobody. So we've just got to keep fighting to help, no for us, for his sake. Because if he rejects us, he's got nobody. There's nobody can, no social worker, nobody can get near him. Nobody has been near him. So this is where we've got to keep trying. In spite of the rejection that he gives us, we've got to become immune to it. He can't sit, he can't concentrate. I took him down to the rent place the other day, and he was standing like that, giving me the mad smile. And the girl was looking, she didn't know, you know, if it wasn't so tragic, it'd be very comical. But it's very, very tragic.
He didn't ask for this illness. And I just feel, I feel so sorry for him. And I feel as if I'll take all the rejection he hands out. I'm going to keep on trying to communicate with him, because he's awful lonely. And it's as if he's cutting off all the roads, and he's backing into this shell. And
well, the worst trouble was he was off his medication. He went to visit a psychiatrist in Woodley Hospital. Psychiatrist interviewed him, and he still wouldn't take his medication, and he left. When he was coming out of the hospital, he asked somebody for the time of day or something. And that is when a police car was apparently cruising, because there had been suspected peeping toms in that area or something. But they arrested Vincent for breach of the peace. They took him to the Kirkentiller police station. He told them he'd been up seeing his psychiatrist. They got in touch with his psychiatrist. His psychiatrist got in touch with us and assured us this was good, which we felt it was good. Rather than have them walking about with no medication in the condition he was in, he could now get his medication. So the psychiatrist says, there's no problem. That's fine. He went from there, from Kirkentiller to Birch Street, from Birch Street to the Sheriff Court, from the Sheriff Court to Ballina Prison. The lawyers that I went to see and the doctors told us that boy should never have been in prison. They reckoned that he attacked them, so in turn they attacked him. They busted his nose, they busted his eye, his feet was all cut. They put him in a cell with no clothes, nothing. And they had him in there for 3 days, wouldn't let him wash or shave or anything. I'm saying 3 days, it may have been more. When you went in to see him in this cell, there were 2 warders, 2 officers. This was in the hospital side of the prison. There were 2 officers come into the cell along with you. And the result was he was frightened, he wouldn't talk, he wouldn't do nothing. Eventually, they put him out into the ward after about a fortnight, or after about a week. And then he started to speak to you, because by then he was, I don't know what he was on like Gacto or whatever they were giving him.
The experience of mentally disordered people being remanded in prison rather than going to hospital is very typical, and in fact probably increasing. And it's one of the major national scandals, I think, of the mental health system. And I mean, the typical scenario is that you have somebody who is schizophrenic, sometimes disturbed, sometimes violent behavior. They go, they hit out, they break a window, they do some kind of criminal damage. Even though everybody recognizes that they're ill and in need of treatment, they end up being processed through the criminal justice system.
Tring in Hertfordshire, one of those comfortable established small towns scattered throughout the home counties. It's also the hometown of university lecturer Dr. Chris Reynolds, his wife and their 3 children. After training as a childcare nurse, their elder daughter Lucy decided to leave home and go to live in a boarding house a few miles away in Aylesbury.
On the Tuesday night, she obviously had a row with her roommate and ended up on the pavement. We're not quite certain what happened next, but we know a car pulled up and she got in. It drove away, and 24 hours later she was in a very distressed condition, although we didn't personally know about it at the time. Quite what happened we don't know, but following that she developed an intense dislike of taxi drivers and made several complaints about robberies, and we know that half her property was missing.
Nobody will ever know whether or not Lucy really had been robbed, but it has now been established that she was hallucinating and suffering a schizophrenic breakdown. Over the next few days, she took a series of taxi rides in and around Aylesbury. Sometimes she jumped out and ran off without paying. On other occasions, she said it was the driver who owed her money. On October the 12th, 1984, she not only refused to pay, but attacked the driver and demanded money from him. The police were called, Lucy was arrested and appeared in court the following morning.
She was in a very distressed condition. She was shouting out, calling and everything else, but she insisted that we weren't told, so we knew nothing of this. The magistrates were obviously very concerned. They asked for a medical report, but it was quite clear that she'd got no long-term permanent address. She refused to allow her parents to be contacted. She was clearly far too distressed to be just let out of the court. So they had no option but to hold her in custody. And the only place they could put her was in fact Holloway.
Lucy was taken 40 miles to London's main remand prison for women because the local mental hospitals had no facilities to cope with her. Chris Reynolds and his wife were horrified when they found out and immediately went down to see her.
One of the features, she was too ill to visit in the visiting room, so we had to visit on the cell block. And she didn't know we were coming. And you could quite often hear her crying out, "Nobody loves me," at the top of her voice, repeatedly. And quite obviously she'd been doing that continuously. And from the way she spoke, her voice was hoarse. She'd been doing that. She found the conditions very oppressive. After about a week or 10 days, she in fact lost her temper and smashed some of the fittings. She was then moved to a strip cell, which just had a bare mattress on the floor, and that was it. And for the 17 weeks she was in Holloway, she was probably in a strip cell for 12 weeks. We're not quite certain on some occasions, and towards the end we didn't visit her on the cell block, so we obviously don't know what cell she was in.
And without wanting to put words in your mouth, I mean, would you say that she deteriorated during that 17 weeks?
Lucy deteriorated steadily for the first 12 weeks or so. Basically, she was someone who liked mixing with other people, liked talking, liked being a social individual, and she was being shut in a strip cell for 23 hours or more a day. Quite clearly, this was having a very disturbing effect on her, and she did her best to attract the attention of the guards whenever she could. When she was out of the cell, she was decidedly reluctant to go back in.
You mean she was put back in forcibly?
Basically, she behaved like a 3-year-old who doesn't want to go to bed. Now, who would want to go to bed in those conditions? But basically, she had to be physically picked up and carried. The guards, in fact, we saw them do this on several occasions, and they were actually most kind in the way they did it. They were concerned about her. I mean, she'd got a very loving personality, and I'm quite sure that in her good spells, they were all impressed by her personality. But obviously in her bad spells, she was difficult to control. But it was quite clear that, if you like, their training and such like as warders, coupled with the most inappropriate conditions, meant that it was nothing like a hospital, and nothing like hospital treatment she was getting.
After more than 4 months in Holloway, Lucy finally appeared before Aylesbury's Crown Court in January 1985 and pleaded guilty to attacking the taxi driver. The judge neither fined nor punished her in any other way. He said that Lucy should be treated in an ordinary ward at Hill End Hospital and stay there only as long as the doctors thought necessary. She was soon well enough to spend periods at home, but then last October, as the anniversary of her imprisonment approached, she became more depressed and returned to hospital.
On the day of the anniversary, the staff, I think, had been particularly kind and attentive to her. And on the following day, she, in fact, broke a window and attempted to cut her wrist on the glass.
Following that, there was a period when Lucy was at home, is that right?
Yes, about a week later, she sort of overcame that depression and came home and seemed very normal for her at this stage. She was planning a possible job interview, present for Christmas, a visit to her grandmother, things of this nature. And this all went apparently without any unusual stress or strain. And if you like, her end when it came was very, very sudden.
On the morning of November the 20th, 1985, Lucy travelled into Aylesbury with her mother for a Christmas shopping trip. After saying she was going to her building society to withdraw some money, Lucy ran to the nearby car park, climbed to the top story and vaulted over the side.
Lucy was very much a victim, I think, of society. She was a friendly, cheerful individual who cared for others. But she didn't get the sort of care which she was quite willing to give to others. My feeling is that society needs more people like her, who are prepared to put themselves out to help others. And to treat her in the way that she was treated was little short of criminal.
Parkhurst is one of Britain's top security prisons. Its most notorious inmates have included Ian Brady, the Cray brothers and the Yorkshire Ripper. A handful of terrorists are also held here, in conditions so secure that film cameras cannot even be pointed in the general direction of their cell block. Within the main part of the prison, there is another prison, the hospital wing, most of whose patients are mentally disturbed. The Principal Medical Officer, Dr. David Cooper, took us on a tour of his hospital, starting off with a visit to a patient diagnosed as suffering from paranoid schizophrenia.
How long have you been in prison this time now, is it?
Since 1979.
Yes. And you moved from prison to hospital, weren't you?
Yeah.
When was that?
1983.
Yes. That was to a special hospital, wasn't it? Which was Park Lane.
Mm.
How did you like it there?
I don't know what to say, you know?
Well, tell the truth.
Well, I didn't.
You didn't like it?
No.
Why was that?
Well, because of some of the things that I've seen and because of some of the things that happened to me.
Yes. But yes, and you've been back into prison how long since they discharged you from Park Lane?
You could call it a year.
Call it a year. Mm. And how have you been since then?
What do you mean, mentally?
Yes.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, nothing was ever wrong with me mentally.
No.
You see?
Yes.
Because I was saying what I thought was wrong all along.
What was wrong? Could you...
Well, what I thought was wrong at the time, I thought I did a certain kind of exercise, yeah? And as gone to my reading, and from what I've been reading in certain book, if you do these exercises and do them wrong, you can get certain throwback, yeah? And I had a certain throwback, but throughout reading other books, such as the Bible and so on, and it explained certain other different things to me, yeah? Then I don't really know what's my view on that, you know? It differs, you know? Because of what I read in the Bible and in calculation with this book, you know?
How do people treat you? Do you think they plot against you?
Well, there's a certain time in my life, you know, when there was some kind of conspiracy going on, you know?
Yes.
I don't know what was the plot or what, but there was some kind of strong motivation going on against me anyway.
Yes.
Right, and then there's another time in my life when everything just seems to change, you know, and all the people who fight against me just seems to be my friend more or less, you know.
He actually is going back to hospital, you know that, don't you?
That's right, yeah.
He's going back to Park Lane, and I think that he should be there and not in prison, and I think probably he should be in hospital for some time, because you do find that you get yourself in lots of fights, don't you, laddie?
What do you mean, for instance, that I should be there for some time? One, I've been given to understood, yes, that I'm going to the hospital, right? And I make it clear, right, that as from what I know and read, right, my release date is coming up very soon, you understand?
Yeah, that's true,
right?
Yes.
And I'm going back to the hospital, yes. Right? And from what I understand, I'm meant to be in this part of the globe at a certain time, yes?
Yes.
And I will be released on my release date.
Yes.
Know sometime about it, you understand?
Yes.
You see, because nothing is wrong with me. I'm sitting here, I'm talking to you properly.
Very good.
You understand?
Yeah.
You see? So I expect to be released on the appropriate date.
Yes.
What sort of training do your members get to cope with the sort of situations that we know they are faced with every day?
Well, practically none. We have in the prison service around 1,000 hospital officers who have some medical training, but not up to qualified nursing standards. In fact, there are only about 100 of those with a formal nursing qualification. So it's minimal, and certainly even less than that with any sort of psychiatric nursing experience.
I mean, if most of that 1,000 were, say, involved in medicine outside, where would they fit into a civilian hospital?
Well, their qualifications simply would not equip them to work in a civilian hospital.
How long have you been
here at Parkhurst, Benjamin?
2 years and 6 months, sir.
How long ago were you? Have you spent most of your sentence here?
Yes, I have, yes.
When you first came to us, you remember you were dirty, you didn't wash yourself, you were in a terrible state. You spent most of your time standing up, looking at the wall, spitting at people, as we said. Why was that?
Because prisoners all knew me, so I didn't like it, you know.
But didn't you behave a bit like it when you were outside?
No, no.
Were you working?
I was for a short time.
Yes, you didn't have a job, did you?
No, I didn't, sir.
You hadn't worked for a long time. Had you seen a doctor when you were outside?
Yes, I've seen a doctor when I was outside.
For what was that?
I broke my little finger.
Not for your nerves at all?
No, not for my nerves, sir.
Hello, Pat.
Patrick is one of Dr. Cooper's success stories. Heavy doses of psychotropic drugs have helped to suppress his schizophrenic symptoms, and he is now stabilised.
Thank you very much.
There is, however, a fine line between the use of drugs for therapy and their use for control.
Certainly there are cases in prison, quite a lot, where we would suspect drugs have been given to prisoners for no other reason than for control measures. Because, quite simply, prison officers do not have the training and the ability to nurse these people properly.
So in a sense it could be officially therapy of some kind or for medical reasons, but the reality is, as it is, I would suggest in many mental hospitals, it is to do with control. Yes, I wouldn't argue against that. I mean, when you were an officer yourself, were you aware of, I mean, was that one of your impressions from the 11 years that you spent as an officer? Yeah, I mean, it has to be said that it is vital for the prison officer to be in charge of the situation in prison. Otherwise, we'd have total disruption and anarchy. But how that is best achieved, with a normal prisoner, we do it by the normal methods and there is a normal expectation that people will behave and conform to regimes. With a mentally abnormal offender, he doesn't know any better, and by hook or by crook, he has to be controlled. I'm not so sure that that's right, the way we do it.
Prison has never really been designed to be a place where treatment can be given. I mean, therapeutic treatment. Obviously, we have to look after the mental and physical health of anybody who comes into the prison. But for highly specialized treatment, especially psychiatric cases, as you say, the prison environment is not only not ideal, it's probably distinctly adverse to that. Having said that, you're in the grip of the dilemma of society. Society has prescribed, rightly in my view, a Mental Health Act which takes out of the system, or should take out of the system, those who are professionally believed to be sufficiently mentally abnormal, mentally disordered, to require treatment outside. But of course that leaves behind in the system really quite a lot of people who are mentally disturbed still, but not sufficiently mentally disturbed to get into the bracket of the Mental Health Act. And it's really what we should do with those that worries me very much.
Well, I've been in numerous hospitals.
Yes. How many can you say offhand?
Well, I should imagine at least about 15.
15?
15 different hospitals in the country.
Why? Did they give you a reason?
Well, I was just trying to get treatment mainly. But, most hospitals didn't want me because I didn't belong in their catchment area, you see.
I see.
What were you trying to get treatment for?
Well, I get voices in the head. This is what a lot of people don't realise. Sometimes I get voices in the head. I'm okay now, but as I say, I can be okay, say maybe for a couple of weeks, and then all of a sudden these things will start on me again.
That's a symptom of schizophrenia, isn't it? Is that
well,
something that's been diagnosed in your case, or?
I have been diagnosed as schizophrenic, and I've also been diagnosed as paranoia as well.
Can I ask why you are in the prison system?
Well, because I committed a crime and was just like anyone else who commits a crime, you know, end up in prison.
But could that crime possibly have been understood better if it had been accepted that you were suffering from, say, voices or whatever may have been disturbing you at the time?
Yes, I think this is the thing, you see, they didn't realise that I was having this trouble. They just thought it was an everyday thing, you know.
What are these voices in your, when you get them in the head? What do they say to you? What do they...
Well, they say things like I'm going to die in the middle of the night and things like that, you know, when I'm laying in my bed of a night time. And of course, when they start doing that, I start feeling as though I'm going to die. My breathing gets very...
Yes.
I haven't told this to many people, but
yes,
my breathing becomes a little bit uncomfortable.
Do they sometimes tell you that people are going to kill you?
Oh, they've done that in the past, yes, they've done that in the past.
And that makes you frightened?
It does, yes. It scares the living daylights out of me.
Does it ever make you feel as though you want to attack people to protect yourself?
Well, a few years back, when I first recognised this problem, I used to think that I was a soldier and that I was trained to do a certain mission. And I had to do that mission or die.
Yes.
And it didn't matter what they said, I had to do it. Or at least I felt I had to do it.
Can you tell me what you were sentenced for?
Well, I was living rough at the time, and I was very hungry and very tired one morning. And for some odd reason, I just did this thing, you know. And
would you like to tell us what it was?
well, I burnt some laundry bags. That was mainly what I was arrested for. I was arrested on suspicion of arson first of all, and then they brought the charge onto me.
And it was some laundry bags that you set fire to?
Yeah. I wasn't setting out to hurt anybody, you know. That's why I made sure it was outside and it wouldn't hurt anyone.
Seems to me, unfortunately, he's served a prison sentence for that. But given that there's some question of his mental stability, this is quite a bad case, is it not?
Yes, I think it's something. It illustrates the point that people with schizophrenia, who are difficult and have a history of difficult behaviour, land up in prison. They're not bad enough, they don't commit serious enough offences to land them into a special hospital like Broadmoor, but nobody else wants them, so they come into prison because the society is nowhere else to put them.
Coping with mentally disturbed offenders requires a considerable amount of understanding, which makes it particularly important that Dr. Cooper's staff are given proper training.
Those prison officers who work in the hospital, prison hospital officers, are already having an increased training. Their training has been doubled from 12 to 24 weeks. And the latter part of that second half, is very much concerned with the sorts of issues which you are concerned with.
We've heard it commented on that situation by, again, the Prison Officers Association, who feel that the training that their members get for working in a hospital wing outside prison would only really equip them to be a hospital porter rather than to be anything to do with therapy or nursing. That suggests that that training is not good enough, and it certainly doesn't compare, does it, with the sort of training outside that nurses are given?
No, it is a different training. It is not as extensive, I quite agree. But added to the figures that I've just given you in the length of training for normal prison hospital officers, up to 30% of those prison hospital officers will also be registered nurses. And the proportion of registered mental health nurses will be, within that, a suitable figure to meet the needs of the sorts of people which we're talking about.
Schizophrenics, as you know, tend to withdraw into themselves. They don't make a fuss unless they do something bizarre, and their attention is not drawn to them unless they do something bizarre, as distinct from perhaps middle-class neurotic ladies who stand up and shout, and as such have a lot of political clout. They don't have any political clout. They just crawl up and go into a corner, and as such they don't draw attention to themselves. And I think it's only by shining a light into dark places and illustrating that the plight of these schizophrenics, that somebody's got to speak on their behalf. They can't do it themselves. And their families, in many instances, are rather ashamed of them, so they don't shout on their behalf. They want it kept quiet. So there's not much pressure, really, being directed towards the mobilisation of resources to help them.
What I've said already in my fears about the people who live rough, the people who have become institutionalized in mental hospitals and who are then put into the community with good intentions, but perhaps where the facilities are not sufficient or appropriate, then I think we are, in fact, liable in the prison system to be the end of the line. In other words, where they don't fit, they transgress, they're a nuisance, society rejects them, and they do something which then makes them a sufficient nuisance that they're arrested and then they're put into the prison system. Now, I can't say that that is not happening and that it's not going to happen more. I just hope that we see the amber light ahead of us and do something about it, at least to minimize it, if not to avoid it altogether.
We've just started the biggest prison building program, which has been embarked upon since the last century. 16 new prisons to improve not only the quality of accommodation within the system as a whole and increase, obviously, the amount that's available, but also to allow us to improve the facilities elsewhere in the older starker Victorian prisons, which ought to be brought up to modern specification and modern accepted standards.
Have some of the pressures to embark on that massive building programme come from the fact that you do have an increasing proportion of mentally ill offenders, and that is one of the pressures to have to expand the prison system?
No, not at all. It's a very general need to contain those whom the court's sentence. We have said quite clearly that if the court sentence them, then they will be accommodated by the prison department. We're trying to bring up our estate to modern day standards, and that is being achieved. We've opened 3 new prisons this year, and I can assure you that those prisons represent a very substantial improvement on existing prisons. And we must remember that we're building for the next century.
Since 1954, the number of residents in psychiatric hospitals in England and Wales has sharply declined, and 67,000 people have been discharged. We can only identify 4,000 in local authority provision, so one has a reasonable concern as to what has happened to the remainder. During that same period, the prison population has been rising. So we looked at the relationship between the psychiatric bed population, number of people in them, and the number of people in prison at the same times in England and Wales since 1950. What we found was that the two ran in conjunction very closely. And I think that it's ironic that the number of new prisons is either 14 or, I believe, Lord Glenarthur says 16 now, and there are 30 or more psychiatric hospitals which are intended to be closed.
What would you like to see done about this situation?
Well, what we don't want to see is a continuation of the present circumstance where these people do finish up in prison and we're not qualified to look after them. Our members are simply not qualified. If, however, government determines that prison is the appropriate place for them, then they must be prepared to support that with resources and more cash in order to train officers to look after these people. It's just not acceptable at the moment. It's not fair to the prison officer, and it certainly isn't fair to the prisoner.
I mean, you've got a choice, haven't you? You can adapt prisons to try and cope with mentally disturbed people, or you could argue that they shouldn't be in the prison system.
Well,
you see what I mean?
You could argue that they shouldn't be in the prison system, but on the other hand, they are sentenced by the courts. And there is another dimension to that, and that is that a lot of these people are the sorts of people who may well be a danger in some respect to the public if they were not in prison. It's one of the considerations, no doubt, of the courts when they remand them or when they're sentenced.
We are dustbins for society, which the flotsam and jetsam, which nobody else really cares about or can deal with, they end up in prison. And it's worthwhile remembering that there's a turnover in prisons during the course of a year of about 500,000, 500,000 people. And often it's the same people coming in and out, the same ones, over and over again. And of that recurring number, a good many of them are schizophrenics. More and more schizophrenics are coming into the prison system, and they're not, nobody will vote for them. The politicians don't care. Why should they?
With their claustrophobic climate of repression and physical violence, prisons have always shared some of the qualities of a powder keg. Unless something is done soon, the chances of somebody applying a lighted match are increasing with the arrival of every abnormal offender, whether they're suffering from schizophrenia, manic depression, dementia, or any other form of mental illness.
He wasn't sleeping. He was getting up early, going out. Then he used to come home. Then he wouldn't eat. And then he used to play records on very, very loud, which I was worried because of the neighbours, you know, how they would react to it. And I thought, well, I've got to get help from somewhere, you know. And he used to go around to his brothers and sisters, you know, and they could tell that he wasn't well. But as I say, you couldn't really say, well, look, you've got to go there and you've got to go somewhere else. You know, it was just some help that I needed, more or less, for him to understand that he should go into hospital and have treatment.
When you went down to social services, what happened?
I went to social services and I told them the situation, how it was, that I couldn't cope at home anymore because the children weren't going to bed, and that he was being too noisy, and therefore, you know, I need somewhere where I could probably get him some treatment. But getting him there is a different point of view.
What did social services offer you?
All they said was, well, can't you bring him here? Which I said, I can't bring him here. I mean, but he was a big man. I couldn't say, you've got to come with me, because he wouldn't take any notice of that, you know. So I just left it at that, and of course I didn't have any help at all from them.
Dorothy Prosser and her husband, who were married in 1968, lived with their 2 children in the Sedgley area of Wolverhampton. Barry Prosser ran his own building company. As a small businessman, he often worked under pressure, and this sometimes led to one of his breakdowns.
He was getting worse of, you know, shouting and putting his records up louder, and of course it was affecting the children, and I just couldn't do any more to help. And I thought, well, if that's the case, I think I went up to my dad's flat and took the children with me. I thought, well, if he give him a break, if he wants to be on his own to sort himself out, then I'll go up there. And that's where I went, up to my father's flat. And in the meantime, on the night, he came up to the flat, was shouting in the street, and of course Alison was asleep. And of course I wouldn't let him in, because I thought, well, I couldn't come there and then because children be in a bed and it was late. So more or less I just told him to go back home, but he wouldn't, you know, and he was trying to get in through the door, which he broke the door handle. And I thought, well, this is where I've got to get the police in to try and get him into, you know, to get some medical care for him. So the police came and they took Barry. He went calmly, and when they come back they had a statement from me. And I said that I didn't want to make a statement, I just wanted more or less him to have medical care, which I had to sign a statement to say what had happened. and therefore he was taken to the police station, and that was it on that night.
So you, in a sense, did that so that he could go to hospital?
Yeah, this is what I said to the police woman that was there, that I didn't want to press any charges, I just wanted medical care for Barry, as, you know, he could get into hospital.
Even though Barry Prosser was only charged with damaging a door handle valued at £1.94p, he was remanded in Winson Green Prison and moved after a week to the hospital wing.
He was quite himself. He was sitting by me. He only got a dressing gown on and a pair of shorts and no shoes or anything. I peeled him an orange, you know. I sat there and we're talking, and he says more or less that he wanted to come out, and that at that time an officer did come out of the room for another officer, and while his back was turned, but he said to me that if he didn't behave himself, they'd kick him between the legs here. He seemed very tense and frightened, and that was the last words he did say. It was, if you don't behave yourself in here, they kick you between the legs, and that was the last thing that he ever said, and we just kissed, and then I went away.
Barry Prosser died in his cell later that night. His injuries included a ruptured stomach, a torn windpipe, and bruises all over his body.
The policeman came to the house and just said that Barry had died, and I couldn't understand what he meant, you know. I couldn't think at all what could really have happened to him. And we had to go over Birmingham on the morning to see Barry. We went to the prison, but they'd already moved Barry to the coroner's. So we had to go over to the coroner's, and we couldn't see, till the following morning, we couldn't see Barry or find out actually what had happened.
The coroner's verdict was unlawful killing. 3 prison warders, including Melvin Jackson, seen here in the centre, accompanied by Staff Association officials, were subsequently tried and acquitted of his murder. Public interest in his death partly reflected a sense of shock that somebody held on remand for medical reports could be killed unlawfully inside a prison.
It's been 6 years, up to 6 years now, and it's never left. It's with you all the time. The children feel it more as well, you know. You keep thinking yourself, well, why Barry? And, you know, you think, well, you go over in your mind to think, well, where could a thing such have happened when he was in prison? And to think that's all that time, he could have gone into hospital and got well, instead that he's ended up dead. And to think that, you know, he's had to die in a place that he didn't deserve that.
I don't think anybody does.
No.
As anybody who's worked in this area for any length of time can tell you, representing the interests of the mentally ill, and in particular the mentally ill offender, is a miserable and ultimately rather depressing experience. For the past few months, we've been like interlopers, tourists with film cameras and a return ticket back to the secure and more comfortable world we come from. But before we go, there is perhaps one final thought. Yes, of course, the obscenity of Barry Prosser's death was the exception rather than the rule. And yes, of course, there may not be that many tragic stories like that of Lucy Reynolds. And yes, there is uncertainty about exactly how many severely mentally disturbed people are being sent to prison wrongly and unjustly. But if it happened to you, or to a member of your family, you'd feel that even one was one too many.